to see it and to listen it. Thank you, Andy, for joining us.
Thanks, Christoph. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Andy Price from Sheffield University. Let me start by sort of apologising first, or explaining that, as Christoph says, I'm not an architect. I'm a political theorist. Therefore, what I'm going to do might be slightly different to what you've been listening to today, but it does tie in quite nicely. You'll see that although I don't really focus on the city or the built environment, it's there in the background in my work and the research I do, and I hope that will come out as we go through today. So the title of my talk is a response to Christoph's title for the day, that Sheffield does not exist, I think he said in his title, and I want to claim that Sheffield exists not yet, and that refers, and we'll come back to it, that refers to a potentiality we can see in the city and in cities in general for building new forms of society. I'm going to look today at some examples of that happening in recent years. Okay, so a bit more detail on that. First, I'm going to start with a little bit of a background on my own research parameters to tell you the kind of thinkers and theories I look at. Then I'm going to look at two examples of this explosion of pent-up potentiality in cities via protests. The first one is the indignados in Madrid, which was the start of the Occupy movement in 2011 when protests came out into the streets and took over the centre of Madrid. We'll come back to that. And then the second one is Occupy Central, which was a couple of years ago in Hong Kong, in the centre of Hong Kong, another Occupy-inspired movement, again, that expressed the potential for protest and the potential for building alternative communities, however brief they might be, within the city. Okay. Finally, I want to do something perhaps a little bit ridiculous, but try and bring it all back round for what those examples mean for the latest round of devolution in our region. So what do they mean? Are there any lessons therein for thinking about how we move towards the Sheffield City region? And we'll come back to that at the end. Okay, so first then, my research, just some background on my research. Two main areas of my research. First is on a particular branch of social theory and a particular thinker, a guy called Murray Bookchin, an American radical political thinker who founded the school known as social ecology. We don't have to go too much into the overall philosophy of it, but social ecology basically argues that all environmental problems are social problems and all social problems are environmental problems, and these two things were linked together by Bookchin in the 70s before anyone was really turning their attention to dealing with environmental issues. So come some key examples of Murray's work. The Ecology of Freedom, 1982. From Urbanisation to Cities is his main work on practice, on how he suggests we change society in light of growing ecological crises, how we might build a new society. And I've examined Bookchin's work as a kind of feasible model for moving towards radical social change, to social change that helps deal with some of the crises we face today. And largely I focused on his political, practical programme. So there's a huge body of work within Bookchin about the philosophy of the link between society and nature. And then there's a huge element that's practical in how he suggests we should move towards building a more ecologically sane society. That's the first element of my work, and it'll come back up later. Second, the other key strand of my research is looking at the theories of globalization. And this ties into something the previous talker was presenter was saying about the response to the McDonaldization of society, the corporate takeover of cities. The globalization movement, as you probably know, are the movements that emerged around the great protests that emerged outside World Trade Organization meetings and IMF meetings over the last, from the mid-1990s onwards. A group of very diverse and dispersed subgroups that came together to protest against essentially neoliberalism, against the move towards a corporate-led form of globalization. So in this, I look at thinkers like Hart and Negri, who chronicled the movement in works such as Empire and Multitude. John Holloway wrote a couple of famous books on the movement, Change the World Without Taking Power and Crack Capitalism. And that gives you the idea, really, the title, Change the World Without Taking Power, what these movements were about. They were about saying, okay, it's the end of the 20th century, start of the 21st century, the old left-right division doesn't work anymore, there is no point in calling for change based on the state. Now change must be something born of globalization. So in a way, the anti-globalisation movement said, okay, enough with neoliberal globalisation, enough with corporatism. However, we want to keep globalisation and move forward on a different footing, which is quite interesting if you think about the anti-globalisation rhetoric that's emerging around Trump and Brexit today. Okay, so that's the background to the research. Okay, and as I say, I'm a political theorist. I sort of had a weird intention that I would spend my entire life in libraries, never go anywhere, just read the theory. And then a couple of things happened that sort of put me down a more practical-based approach that made me look at practice. The first was Madrid in 2011. So I lived in Madrid for a couple of years, and in 2011, and I promise you I'm not going to show you some holiday clips here, just for a bit of background. In 2011, a protest emerges in the centre of Madrid, and it was a protest that was completely new in Madrid, completely new in Spain, and new around the world, and we'll see why shortly. So these are a couple of shots of the central square, Puerta del Sol in Madrid. And I just put them there to show you the sides of the buildings, how the buildings all look out on the square. Because what was interesting for me about these movements is how they adapted and adopted the local environment, the built environment, and made them into forms of protest. So that's the centre of Madrid pre the protest. And then from May the 15th, 2011, this happened. The central square was taken over, not just for a one-day protest, but for the establishment of a lived-in camp. And for 4 weeks, thousands of protesters took the square, built a mini-city within the square, and used the square, used the side, the built environment, used all of the square as a form of protest. The protest wasn't a particular march, it wasn't by a party, the actual camp itself was the protest. That is, they set up a camp based on local direct democracy. There was committees, subcommittees, some of which we'll come back to later. There was real ingrained, deep levels of organisation. And forever and always, the people in the camp were saying, this is what we want. This is the society we want. We've not got a traditional set of demands. We've not got a 10-point plan. We've not got a particular party to follow. What we're doing in this camp right now during these 4 weeks is the kind of society we want. And I'll come back to that again in a second, but I just wanted to show you a few pictures, what they did to the side of the buildings, how they took over the buildings. If you see this one here, where it says Democracia Real Now, which was one of the movements. They actually took what was a L'Oreal poster and turned it into a slogan. People of Europe rise up. You can see slogans everywhere. The top picture is actually 5 days after the protest begins, when the entire place was totally full for most of the night and most of the morning, with people who'd come down to see the camp. People had come from all over Madrid and Spain to see what was happening in this camp. It was incredible. I was there for the 4 weeks, not staying with them, but with them during the day, every day. And it was incredible how every day people would come and watch, because the decision-making processes that were going on there were open. People would come and watch. They'd come from offices after work, and they'd stand and watch. And before long, the people who were stood and watching were sat down and involved in this decision-making, in this new form of decision-making. So it just grew phenomenally over the 4 weeks. Yeah, that's just the pictures we're going to show you there. Democracia Real Ya, real democracy now. They don't represent us in the middle. It was very well organised as well. There was a very conscious desire for it not to be portrayed as anarchist and out of control. So there was no drink allowed or drugs allowed in the site, and this was mostly young university students and young activists. So you can see there, Más revolución, menos botellón, more revolution, less drinking. It was very well organised, and again, that was this conscious effort to say, we are young people, we're struggling under neoliberalism, we're struggling, in fact, after the 2008 financial crash more than ever, but we don't want dramatic revolution, we don't want violence, we want what we're doing here, what you can see us doing here. We want to be involved in decision-making. Some more pictures. This is the entrance to the metro. Puerta del Sol was the name of the square. It's the name of the square in Madrid. They changed it to Plaza de la Solución, the place of the solution. The sign you can see here at the centre, learn to resist the violence that is inside you and outside of you. There's some great signs on the metro station. Spain is not a business. We are not slaves. All of this kind of stuff. Most interesting, though, if we just go back to this one here, You can see the blue tarpaulin in the middle. This was the roof of the camp that they'd established by 3 or 4 days after the camp had started. And under that roof were where they'd organised all their committees and subgroups. You can see the blue tarpaulin here. Under the roof they had a water system, a sprinkler system that kept everybody cool. They'd arranged it that tourists and other passers-by could walk through and watch what was happening. It's incredibly well organised. There was a tannoy system that told people to turn up to different places. Here you can see some of the living quarters. Here you can see the library, the biblioteca. In the background there you can see one of the meetings taking place. So they'd split into subcommittees to look after security, food, childcare, gender more generally they were looking at, gender, international politics. There are all these subgroups that would then come together and meet later on. So this camp emerges, lasts for 4 weeks and transforms what was a pretty soulless commercial square in Madrid. It's the commercial and tourist hub of Madrid, dominated by the big chains, dominated by corporate globalization, and they transformed it in these 4 weeks. By the way, they're called Los Indignados, the indignant, or El Movimiento 15, because they emerged on the 15th of May. So, burst on the scene on the 15th of May. They were just a small protest. At the original wasn't much of them, but they were cleared by the Spanish riot police on May the 17th, 2 days later, and the very next day they tripled in size, quadrupled in size, because of the news coverage they got. And by the 20th of May, the camp was unmovable. There's no way the police could move them. There were so many people involved and so many people interested. So 20th May, 12,000 people were down in Sol, and they stayed all night just to observe this new project in communal protest. Okay, so very quickly, some of the things I've already said. 4-week mini-city emerges in this square, and there's councils and committees for each assembly: food, maintenance, security, childcare, communications, immigration, gender. Every night they would have a general assembly where everyone who'd been working in the subcommittees would come and bring their ideas, and then they'd agree on motions. I don't know if you've ever seen any footage of this. They had non-aggressive forms of communication. So no clapping was allowed because that was seen as aggressive. So they just used to do this to agree. So you would see thousands of people sat in this square all doing this and agreeing, and that's when these people would come from the office afterwards and they'd look and they'd think, what the hell's going on here? See everyone doing this or this, which meant next speaker, and before long everyone else was getting involved. You had all these office workers doing it as well. So consciously structured in the way we've said, laid out in such a way to allow people to see what was happening, and a commitment to peaceful, orderly protest. Well, by the way, one of the greatest signs I think I ever saw there was this. So in the Spanish press, nobody could understand this movement. The Spanish press, being just like the press here, was saying, okay, where do you come from? Where can we put you on the left-right spectrum? Who are your political leaders? What is your political program? And they were just saying that there isn't one. There isn't one. We're having a really bad time post-2008, 50% youth unemployment at the time in Spain, a really bad time, and we just want to show everybody that we're here and we can envisage a different world and can envisage a different world in our city. One of the greatest signs right in the centre of the camp was, in Spanish, it translates into English as, "Mother, this is what you have taught me, thank you." And everyone used to stop and take pictures of this, and that was basically the message. Look, we're doing what we do with our family and friends. It's being denied to us under corporate-led globalization, and we want to show you that another world is possible. Okay, so on the 12th of June, it disbands after 4 weeks, but not before establishing what they called Toma los Barrios, which was the taking of, translates as take the neighborhood. It basically, the set up of smaller versions of the same in the neighborhoods of Madrid. Okay, so the movement lasted. It lasted for a long time after the camp had disbanded. The same camps, not residential camps, but the same meeting structures were set up in areas around Madrid. So an important movement. Across Spain, it spreads like wildfire. I think up to 8 million people are estimated to being involved in it in Spain. It falls off the agenda a little bit when the camp from Madrid goes, and the camps in Barcelona and Valencia and other places. And it falls off the radar a bit, and again, the old political establishment thinks, oh, well, that's the end of it. However, 3 months later, Occupy erupts in Zuccotti Park in New York, and again, everybody cites the indignados, the 15 movement as the precursor, and the exact same pattern is re-established. permanent, open, peaceful camps occupy prominent places in cities like New York, later London, we know, the London Stock Exchange had a camp outside for many weeks. The place in Madrid in Spain is explicit as the inspiration. And soon, not only would London follow, but as The Guardian reported, towards the end of 2011, Occupy camps had emerged in 951 cities across 95 countries. What had started with that brief protest in Madrid had spread to London and New York and then spread around the world, including to Hong Kong. Okay, I'm going to come back to how that ties into the theory in a second, because the theory I'd been looking at up until this point, the theory of Murray Bookchin, Hart and Negri, Holloway, was describing this exact movement. It was describing this exact movement. They were all chronicling the emergence of alter-globalization and saying one of the key elements of alter-globalization that makes it a different form of social protest today is that it's a product of the networked reality of globalization itself. That is, there is no one narrative anymore. The world's connected, many different worlds are connected within that world. There cannot be just one narrative of the left or the working class or whatever. It was all these different groups coming together. The only way you could make those different groups work was by local, direct control over decision making. We'll come back to that. But quickly, and I'll just fly through some of these. 3 years later, I was in Hong Kong with work, and a movement erupts there. It seemed to be following me around somehow. A movement erupts there based on the early Occupy stuff, and it was Occupy Central that emerged around the same time as Occupy New York and London, which was quite a strong example of the Occupy movement. That lasted from October 2011 for almost a year in different forms, but nothing like the occupation we'll see shortly. Numbers were small as well in Hong Kong at this time, and the camp was basically cleared finally in September 2012. However, 2 years later, in 2014, the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government announced that they would screen candidates for the local elections in Hong Kong to the Legislative Council, if I've remembered the name correctly, or the Legislative Assembly. And there was a great protest that emerged against this, at the idea that China could decide who the people and who the local people who voted for this Legislative Assembly could choose. And in response to this, excuse me, in response to this, a new camp emerges. Occupy Central re-emerges right in the heart of Hong Kong. And this was even more striking in terms, if we think about the environment it was in, more striking than the Madrid example. For those of you that will know Hong Kong, or you'll know the pictures of the skyline anyway, this thoroughfare was one of the main thoroughfares right through the central business district, through the financial district, and it was entirely taken over by this camp over a series of a couple of nights, and the camp lasted for several weeks, if not months. And again, the same thing happened. And we'll just fly through some of these. But the same thing happened in terms of shutting down a particular part of the city and showing publicly and visibly a form of protest that said, this is what we want. This is what we want. We're not a political party. We're young people. This is our city. This is how we want to live. Okay, and you just see various examples here of people in movements. There was this place here was a long row of connected, it was like an internet cafe basically for students. It was where students could do, because it was during the term, and it was set up specifically so you could come and protest but still get your essays written. So there's all these places where students would just go, look, student first, welcome to you, student first. It was always about, excuse me, allowing the students to get the work done. They just took some of these snaps to show how close to the centre it was, what a transformation of the centre it was. That's the HSBC building, one of the most famous buildings in Hong Kong. The camp ran right up basically to the outskirts of the square, which the HSBC building was. The movement eventually became known as the Umbrella Movement. I think largely, and only because it was really bad weather when it first emerged and everyone was there in the umbrellas, and the umbrella became a symbol of the movement. They took over these walkways, again became slogans. You see the John Lennon, you may say I'm a dreamer, I'm not the only one. This is one of the favourite bits. This was the Lennon Wall. And this is on one of the steps from the street up to the street above it. And it just became a place where everybody who'd come to see the camp, and everyone who was in the camp, and spectators or tourists or whatever, would just leave a little note on Post-it. But incredible, it took over the whole of the walkway. Messages from all around the world. And that's it from a distance, you can see. And again, it was the same idea of making a statement with the built environment, of saying something publicly and visibly about an alternative way of organising society. Excuse me. So, that was Hong Kong. So, just returning to theoretical precursors to this. As I said at the beginning, I was looking at thinkers like Bookchin, like Hart and Negri for years, and looking at what they said about globalization, and they were always saying this is a movement of movements, a movement made up of many diverse movements that, for the first time perhaps in leftist politics, was not about the state. It was actually below and above the state. The people who were connecting as part of globalization were people from the global north, the global south, and they were connecting via the internet, a new thing in the 90s and 2000s. And it's probably just part of your lives, it feels new to us still. That new thing in the 90s and the 2000s that connected people around the world and allowed them to organise. And before these movements erupted, thinkers like Bookchin and like Hart and Negri had talked about how you make these new connections into a full movement, how you make them into a movement that critiques society and can maybe one day propose a lasting alternative. And just to return to Bookchin slightly, Bookchin argued his political programme he eventually would call communalism. Overall, he argued that the link between society and nature and society shows one thing, that the most successful ecosystems in the natural world are the most diverse, the ones with the most living organisms that participate with each other in a number of ways, be they even prey and predation or whatever. But the most successful ecosystems are always the most diverse, the ones with the most participation, i.e. the life forms had more routes to choose. And his argument was that society should be the same. The wrong turn that society has taken is to simplify via the economic system we use, via capitalism, via the move towards neoliberalism, to simplify society and remove it of all of its diversity. What we need to do, Bookchin argues, is to reintroduce diversity as a social form into our societies to try and address some of the crises we face, first and foremost the ecological crisis. To do this, he argued for a programme called communalism. And he said communalism basically is the way we challenge advanced capitalism. We can't challenge capitalism, advanced capitalism, through trade unions, through left-right politics. We've got to do something different, and that something different was communalism. In this, he said, there's a maximum and a minimum programme. Okay, and this is important because the ultimate goal is the transformation of society as we know it to a society based on local direct decision-making. But of course, that is, or at least feels, millennia away. It feels a very long way away. That's the maximum goal. There's an awful amount of change that has to happen before we get there. So in that sense, he argued that there's a minimum programme. And the minimum programme is that which accords most closely to the examples we saw in Spain and Hong Kong. So he argued that the minimum programme is basically this act of getting together as protest groups and starting to make decisions about different things in your area, in your community. It could be a neighbourhood watch scheme. It could be anything in your local area. Murray Bookchin was writing in the 80s about New York, and he talked about breaking New York down into city blocks, into the neighbourhoods of New York, to start these local groups. And these local groups were never designed to take power immediately from the state. They were there just to get the individuals involved back into the process of political decision-making, of deciding how to distribute particular goods in a particular area, deciding how to run local organisations. So it could be neighbourhood watch schemes, it could be, I'll look at Christoph for this, it could be residents' association meetings. But it was about basically bringing people back in somehow to the political process. Essentially, in the long run, it's about building a different type of citizen, one that isn't based on the cities as we know them today as commercial and consumerist centres. It was about building other alternative social forms. And of course, for Bookchin, the point wasn't to build these things to build a revolution now, it was actually to build these things to change the individuals involved. So Bookchin always talks about the agent of change in these organisations, so the people who organised Occupy, the people in Spain and in Hong Kong, the most important thing to change is those people themselves. The agents of change, nobody enters into these processes, Bookchin would argue, and comes out of them the same person. They come out a very different person, and it changes their approach to society. So again, he called for popular assemblies, local action committees, rooted in communities, campuses, schools, professional arenas, and factories, offices, and research establishments. And this is where, just to run through this, citizens can learn to initiate and institutionalise their own empowerment. And again, down at the bottom, Bookchin tells us, no one who participates in a struggle for social restructuring emerges from that struggle with the prejudices, habits, and sensibilities with which he or she entered it. And that was the most important thing. Not actually the fact that it was leading to revolution, or that revolution would be anywhere around the corner any day soon, but that the people involved would leave these projects and go onto other things. So, finally, I'll just bring this back to Sheffield perhaps in a second, but just a couple more things on that, and then I'll come back to Christoph's title. What happened then? Is Bookchin right? Was Bookchin right? Were some of the other thinkers right about the effects this kind of protest has on individuals? What happened, for example, to the people involved in the indignados camp in Madrid? The camp disappeared. The movement itself largely disappears. However, we know, a couple of years later, right up to the present day, mainstream Spanish politics is changed forever by the emergence of a new group, a group called Podemos, who you might have heard of. Meaning yes we can. And Podemos, whilst being made up of different people, some people from Occupy, but not entirely a straight line between Occupy and Podemos, but Podemos emerge and copy the exact same model as Occupy. Without the occupation, without the camp, they call for what they describe as circles. That is, they say we are not a political party, we're not a national party, we're about to compete in national elections, but we will compete on the basis of decisions made in local circles. And the circle is essentially their name for the assembly. So they called for local assemblies at the local level that could make decisions, discuss policy, and bring them to the national level. And if anyone's been keeping their eye on Spanish politics, they were the last elections, or the elections that first took place in December last year, have only just been resolved. I think they've only just finally formed a government a month ago or so, because Podemos emerges, a group on the right emerges to challenge the establishment in response to Podemos, and they just take all the votes away from the mainstream parties, the duopoly that had dominated Spanish politics since the move to democracy in the late 70s. So a real effect on young people who were involved in the movement in Madrid in 2011, an effect that has a lasting change. In Hong Kong, what's happening? The movement has gone, the camp's gone, but we know there are now 2 members of the Legislative Council, if that's the right word, the phrase escapes me right now, who were involved in Occupy, who've currently been disbarred from the Legislative Chamber for a number of reasons, and there are protests emerging again around that, and it leads from these kind of earlier forms of protest. These things leave their mark. And thinkers like Bookchin, Hart and Negri, Holloway, always and forever state that we should never get disheartened with the fact that there are just these eruptions of globalization or Occupy, and then they disappear, because in fact they leave a legacy. They leave a legacy because they're an important expression of that other element of society that the previous speaker was talking about. You know, we know what the cities are like. We know what cities in the West are like. They're commercial, consumerist hubs. We know that, but there is this other side to them. There is this other side, this potentiality for something totally different. And we know it, actually, in our private lives, because we go out and we enjoy cities in incredibly different ways, diverse ways. It might just be going to a club or a pub or restaurants or an art gallery, but there's all this other stuff going on. People like Holloway and Butchin argue that the expression of those kind of things in a political form should never be seen as something that fails or just comes and goes, because it's a historical, leaves a historical mark. Okay, so very quickly, I'll try and then bring this round to Sheffield devolution a little bit. What does this mean for the move towards the devolution that we see in the Sheffield city region? Okay, and I'm not for one second equating these two things. They're not the same thing, but what does it mean? How do we as citizens, and I'm not suggesting we go out and camp in the middle of Sheffield either, but how do we as citizens respond to devolution as currently being passed down through the Northern Powerhouse agenda and through the Sheffield city region? Is there something we can learn from the Occupy movements that say, actually, to express this other side of the city, we might need new social forms. We might need new social forms that aren't necessarily radical. We're not talking about the dramatic makeover of society right now, but we might need something like a people's assembly. We might need something that exists outside of the current local authority structures. How will devolution work? If you know anything about the Sheffield City Region devolution, it's going to 9 Sheffield Council and 8 others to form a larger body. If we just leave it as citizens to the old local authorities, and that's not to criticise the old local authorities, they do what they do, but if we leave it to them, will it be any different? Will it allow the expression of this different type of civic life? The suggestions made by Occupy Hong Kong, Occupy Madrid, the Kintiemi movement, is that actually the camps were an important element of expressing the other side of the city. The camps and the decision making, that is about formulating this new idea of citizenship. A new idea of citizenship that isn't just about a citizen who comes into the centre for consumerist fun, comes in for leisure, but comes in for something else. And the idea is that in the move towards Sheffield devolution, there might be the need for some form of new place where citizens can get together and talk about policy. Not the council chamber, not go to talk or watch how the council works, but something different, something based on different values, perhaps. So, just to finish then, if devolution to the Sheffield to the SCR is to be meaningful, it has to somehow allow for a new conception of citizenship, new forms might be needed, you know, even if that is just a local authority sanctioned local assembly or groups, subgroups, circles, for example. This might need a new physical space for citizenship to emerge. So the structure of the city might need to reflect this. Now, if you're keeping your eye on what's going on in Sheffield in terms of Sheffield devolution, at the same time, Sheffield regeneration is taking off at quite a pace. If you look at the regeneration that's going on around the Grosvenor Hotel and stuff, and again, that's a particular form of regeneration. It's a particular form of regeneration. Therefore, again, we might ask the question, is this moment, as devolution is happening, a moment for citizens, concerned citizens, to say, actually, we'd like to have a voice here as well. We'd like to suggest how devolution works from below rather than just from above. Okay, I've missed my quote, and let me just finish with coming back to Christoph's quote, Christoph's title. My quote seems to have gone missing. Is that it? Ah, here it is. Oh, sorry. Go to... Okay, this is a quote that I just thought I came across as I was looking at Christoph's title. And this is a thought, this is Holloway in Crack Capitalism, written in 2010, before the indignados, but about AntiGlobalisation. And he was trying to explain that thing that happens on the left when movements emerge and then they disappear, and how people get disheartened with that idea. And people get disheartened that there's a huge protest in Seattle or Genoa or wherever, and then it stops and change seems to stop. But Holloway tells us that they're not failures. He says such explosions are seen as failures because they do not lead to permanent change, but this is wrong. They all have a validity of their own, independent of their long-term consequences. He goes on to say, like a flash of lightning, they illuminate a different world. And think of the examples we've looked at, Madrid and Hong Kong. Like a flash of lightning, they illuminate a different world, a world created perhaps for a few short hours, but the impression which remains on our brain and our senses is that of an image of the world that we can and did create. And he finishes by saying, the world that does not yet exist displays itself as a world that exists not yet. So in the idea that Sheffield doesn't exist in any meaningful sense in terms of community, perhaps we could turn that around to say it doesn't exist just yet. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. Can I invite the last three speakers to join Andy on the platform, please? And we're going to take some questions from the audience. So Nishat, Carl and Simon.